Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of the Daily Friend Show. I'm your host, Nicholas Lorimer, today, joined by Sara Gon. Sara, how are you doing?
I'm just a bit sort of confused. I thought today was Sunday.
Yeah, no, this whole week with the public holiday in it has kind of scrambled my brain a little bit. We're also joined today by Makone Maja. Makone, how are you doing?
Glad it's Thursday.
Yes, I feel very much the same. Let me just quickly, let's do our first story, and then I'm going to do a word from our sponsor, which I actually forgot to put in my notes here, so apologies to our sponsor for that. But anyway, that's coming up in a second. Let's start with our first story today, which is a big problem for Julius Malema and the EFF, who have had, should we say, a bit of a mixed week. They got a lot of media attention for the national shutdown, as we talked about yesterday, supposedly national shutdown. But they've also gotten a lot of mockery and negative media attention, claiming that the whole thing was a bit of a mess. And that seems to have been compounded now because the EFF have lost what is, I think, symbolically quite an important court case. So I'm sure anyone who has followed the career of Julius Malema knows that when the EFF got started in particular, it had a habit of calling for land to be very directly invaded. It said that landless people should go and occupy whatever property they please. And this is clearly sort of part of its ideological project to destroy the idea of private property rights. There were numerous occasions between 2014 and 2016, in particular, where Julius Malema made this call, but he's generally had a sort of fairly anti-property rights attitude, which goes against the constitution, which gives you the right to own property in South Africa. Well, AfriForum got an interdict against him in 2017, where they said that you can't encourage people to go and break the law, which is what invading private property is. It's against the law. Malema and the EFF decided that they were going to challenge this in court, and they've gone now through a many years legal battle. I think it's been 6 years since the interdict was launched, and it's landed up in the Constitutional Court. And yesterday, the Constitutional Court not only denied it, but also said that they can't have leave to appeal, saying that the application should be dismissed. The leave to appeal application should be dismissed as it bears no reasonable prospects of success. And essentially now it looks like the EFF are pretty close to being out of legal options on this, meaning that they are no longer, at least legally, going to be protected if they call for invasions of private property. AfriForum's legal team said this ruling is yet another major win for the right to private property and a devastating loss for those who would incite criminality and violence. And they, of course, welcomed the Constitutional Court's reaffirming of the High Court interdict. Sara, what do you make of this? This does seem like, at least, I don't know if it's actually going to stop any land invasions, but it certainly seems like in the battle of ideas that this is an important step to kind of, say you can't go and tell people to break the law if it involves messing with property.
No, I think it's actually incredibly important for a whole lot of reasons. One, it affirms the right to own property. That's privately, that is, that would be one of the bases for opposing expropriation without compensation, and it gives a certain amount of encouragement to that issue, which is ongoing. It's the senior court in the land. I'm sorry, I haven't had yet an opportunity to read the judgment, but it's particularly important, I think, that it is the EFF who've brought the action, who've been told by the court they have no chance of success, and that's it. You may not illegally occupy land. It's important because the impression, not only is it a tactic of the EFF, and it's very disruptive, that it can literally completely destroy a municipality or a province's ability to provide access to land for people, who are awaiting housing. But it also says that we are immune if we get people to invade land enough, we hold a sort of power that you've got to pay attention to, and also cause a lot of problems in the process. It also, but it sort of, so it dents the EFF's revolutionary style of conducting itself. It's very much a resolution to an issue through the processes that are allowed in a proper democracy, namely the judicial system. Now, the next option for the EFF, of course, is to ignore it, or to ignore the proper processes and go for the purely revolutionary option, which one of Gareth van Onselen, an ex-colleague, said is, that will actually essentially put an end to the EFF, because that isn't what South Africans want to follow by and large. So it's interesting, because they went the full they took the full course of going to the Constitutional Court, and it's been found against them. And it's both symbolically important against the EFF, but it's also important to the lawmakers in the ANC that, they can't necessarily rely on the Constitutional Court to support its legislation all the way up. That doesn't mean there aren't lots of fights still to be had by any stretch of the imagination. But I think for people who value democracy and see private property ownership as a core part of living in a democracy, it's important to know that the court had our backs in that regard.
So I was quite amused by some of the EFF's arguments in this court case. They first argued that the crime of incitement itself unjustifiably limited the constitutional right to freedom of expression, and that it was too broad and it would prevent people from being able to speak out against unjust laws. But also that, Malema never called for anyone to act violently, which I think is a debatable point. And that it was simply an encouragement of peaceful civil disobedience. They secondly argued that you can't encourage a crime. This wasn't the encouragement of a crime, because there is no such thing as illegally occupying land, because the Prevention of Illegal Eviction Act and Extension of Security of Tenure Act means that people are protected when they occupy land and they need a court order to evict them, and therefore it's not really a crime to go and illegally occupy land. Which seems to be a little bit of a misunderstanding of exactly what this piece of legislation is supposed to do. But Makone, what do you make of this court case?
I paid specific attention to those arguments as well, Nick, and I don't think it's necessarily a misunderstanding. I think you have pointed out the modus operandi of the EFFs, which is that they call for their members to act illegally, right? To either shut down businesses or to go and claim ownership of land that does not belong to them. And then they abdicate themselves of that responsibility by saying, well, PI, the Prevention of Illegal Eviction Act, protects private property owners anyway, so no one can actually take land that does not belong to them. This is how the EFF operates. And I hope that South Africans can see that though they purport to act in their best interests, they really just want to get them in trouble and then stand on the sidelines and say, well, the law prevents that from happening anyway, and so we couldn't have possibly intended for you to actually go and evict people. One thing about this case for me, above it just being EFF versus AfriForum cases, I particularly enjoy spectating cases where fundamental elements of our democracy, right, the right to freedom of expression / incitement, which it clearly was, versus the private ownership of property rights are battled out at the Constitutional Court, the highest court of the land. So for me, this was a very interesting case to observe how the court weighs those two rights. And I use air quotes because I still don't see how incitement could possibly be a right to freedom of expression, as the EFF argued. But it reinforces and encourages us to still value at least one arm of the government, which is the judiciary, right? It constantly stands for democratic processes and smacks down any amenability to authoritarian means of consolidating power, which we see the EFF constantly pushing in South Africa. So not only a big victory for private property ownership rights, but also very interesting to spectate for me, these two fundamental elements of democracy being battled out at the Constitutional Court.
So Sara, before I get your final thoughts, I guess One of the central problems here, however, is going to be one of enforcement, right? We've so often seen that sort of there'll be a court something against the EFF, or there'll be some kind of issue where they run into trouble with the law. But let's just say it's not pursued as vigorously by law enforcement authorities as if you or I had perhaps done it. Firstly, what do you make of that argument? Do you think that this is really going to change the EFF's rhetoric on this? And secondly, just any final thoughts you have there?
No, I was going to say that, you see, what the EFF has done, I'm not sure it will really change things, but it does make the EFF itself more vulnerable. Now, it's clear, it's out there, everyone knows about it. The problem, of course, it's relying on the fact that in the space between inciting the occupation and the points at which the protection of people who have taken possession of the land kicks in is actually very short. So the Act foresees that, within a very short period, it becomes increasingly more difficult to get people off your land. Court cases become inevitable, applications to court become inevitable, etc. So in practical terms, it's a very short period. And so, the EFF, the problem of perhaps the one area that where it can work is the fact that there's usually one person from the EFF in charge of a particular land invasion. And so it may be easier to identify the person they want to prosecute. But it's not, in practical terms, as you say, it's about having the enforcement mechanisms, really available like that. And a lot of the time we don't.
All right, so before we move on, a word from our sponsor, which I apologize should have been the beginning of the show. Our sponsor is once again today Bitvice, and just some words from them. Bitvice says, exchanges are crashing, banks are on the run and being bailed out, and the money printer is going faster than ever before. Bitcoin was built for this, but it's worthless if you keep it on an exchange, which then just collapses and they run away with your money. Enter Bitvice, South Africa's only place to buy Bitcoin, and have it sent directly to your self-custody wallet. That means should Bitvice ever shut down, your Bitcoin is entirely safe as it is fully within your control. It's like having gold in your own safe at home rather than at a bank where you need a receipt to prove ownership. Bitvice offers advice on how to set up the best self-custody solution to achieve maximum security for your Bitcoin and keep it safe during the tumultuous times ahead. To make accumulating Bitcoin easier than ever, Bitvice's SAT stacker allows you to set up a repeat purchase of Bitcoin on a weekly or monthly basis. Bitvice is the safest way to accumulate Bitcoin. Head over to bitvice.io and set up your account today, or click the link in the description of this show and find out more about SAT stacker. And we thank them very much for sponsoring us again. Okay, let's move on to some news coming out of the International Monetary Fund about the state of the South African economy. The IMF has said that South Africa must urgently implement reforms to boost private sector investment. This is a call we have seen from many kind of, I would call, the sort of more respectable, low-key, non-political business institutions over the past few years. And that there needs to be urgent reform in order to rescue the South African economy from where it's currently sitting. The IMF recently, I believe, had some economists tour the country to have a look at economic conditions here. And let's just say I don't think it went well, because in January, the IMF was estimating that South Africa would achieve 1.2% GDP growth this year. That's very low, but, it's something. That's now been downgraded to 0.1% in 2023, they reckon, is how much South Africa will accomplish this year. And it's lower than the National Treasury's projection, which is 0.9% economic growth this year. The IMF said South Africa's public debt is among the highest in emerging markets and is set to continue rising on current policies. This leaves limited fiscal space to respond to adverse shocks, including from contingent liabilities from state-owned enterprises, social spending needs, and climate events. It also exposes the government to increasing borrowing costs, diverting limited resources away from more productive capital and social spending. At the same time, we're also seeing inflation going up again a little bit, not by a huge amount, but for the first time since July of 2022, inflation has gone up a bit, and it seems to be being driven mostly by food prices. This stat worried me quite a lot when I saw it. The price of mielie meal, maize meal has increased by 35% in the past year. And to, I think, all South Africans, the price of rusks apparently jumped 7% in a single month, which is not great. I think because we all enjoy our rusks, and this shows that the economic pressure on South Africans is only increasing. Makone, what's your takeaway from these stories about the place we find ourselves in economically?
Just on the IMF's tour of the country, we know what that really means is that they met with a couple of government officials and maybe some private sector actors here or there. And what they came away with was the government actually has no plan on how it's going to bounce back from its pre-COVID GDP forecasts, right? Despite the fact that many other emerging countries have already rebounded. So we know now that the government has no plan to alleviate South Africa from a lot of its financial pressures. And it's particularly worrying when you cite like 35% increase in maize meal. Maize meal is a staple in the South African household. And so it's only a matter of time before something needs to give. But it's at least telling of whether or not government has a plan and what South Africans are to do with that.
Yeah. So, Sara, what's your take on this? I mean, to me, the most tragic thing here is how they point out that South Africa public debt is among the highest in emerging markets, because, of course, during that period, those good years of South Africa's growth between sort of 2005 and 2008, we ran a budget surplus. And our fiscus was one of the strongest things that the ANC government had managed to achieve. It was arguably their greatest success in office, is that they had managed to carry out this massive expansion of social services and the state, while at the same time managing to create a budget surplus. It was almost like a sort of kind of wizardry as a result of some of the good policies they had. And now that is the opposite. We're without money, we're in debt. And things don't seem to be turning around. What's your take on this?
I know this sounds perverse, but I'm actually kind of pleased that the IMF has said our growth this year is 0.1%, and it's probably an overstatement in any event. And it, nothing we've just said, we haven't said 1,000 times before, we haven't observed 1,000 times before. But what it does is it sort of gives a little bit of not a lie, because the people who are expressing it are not ill-intentioned, but when business commentators and politicians or and observers look at our situation and they complain bitterly about the fact that the government, that Cyril Ramaphosa, has not implemented their reforms. They don't have reforms. Their reforms are to be found in EWC, NHI, and a whole raft of restrictive laws. But economically, they don't have reforms. So I don't know why people keep referring to their reforms. What they're referring to is the impression created by Cyril Ramaphosa that they have reforms. And I think that's the reality, is what the IMF is reflecting, is that we are no closer to doing anything new, different, and necessary than we were 3 years ago. So it's literally more of the same. I mean, we're just, it's almost like sinking into, I won't say quicksand because it implies quick, but it'll become quicker. But that sense of we're in it and we're just carrying on going down because there are no reforms.
So I think the ANC has actually been extremely skilled for a very, very long time at really controlling the foreign overseas narratives about what South Africa was like and what its problems were and what it was doing. And I really feel like that's been cracking up for the past few years. And this, to me, is a big sign that the ANC's sort of happy talk is finally kind of disappearing. There's so much foreign commentary about South Africa that is written is very low quality, right? It's just kind of says something about apartheid, says something about the ANC, says some vague stuff about corruption, but it doesn't really understand the ANC or anything like that. It just repeats talking points that Cyril or his spokespeople have put out. And I think it's interesting to me that as Makone said, they would have met with a whole bunch of people when they came here, and presumably they got the government line. But when seeing it face to face, the IMF sort of went, "Ooh, oh, no. This doesn't make any sense at all. And I think it really does speak to the collapsing credibility of the ANC on the international stage, which is probably, as you know, not to once again be perverse, but it suggests that we're heading to a world where the rest of the world is not going to be willing to cut the ANC so much slack. You know, the spirit of Nelson Mandela and the Rainbow Nation and such is very quickly evaporating. And the reality of what the ANC is in the year 2023 is, I think, becoming much harder to ignore for overseas observers. Makone, any final thoughts?
Very interesting times where we cannot no longer hang the goodwill of the country on Nelson Mandela. That seems to be a relic of the past. But I think you're onto them, Nick. I think that the ANC's reputation among global actors, such as the IMF, is finally being seen for what it really was. My suspicion is that they'll respond to the IMF. They will table a bunch of reforms. We may even get a new minister of reform, but nothing will really happen. So these tabled reforms will just be another vanity metric of the ANC trying to look like it's doing something. But if anything, I suspect those reforms will only be antithetical to what the IMF is calling for, which is the ANC vying for more power grab, more consolidation of power into the government instead of looking to private sector actors to see how they can intervene, despite the fact that they've been waving on the sidelines for a very long time saying, we want to participate, we want to help. But my suspicion is that these reforms will be tabled, but that none of them will actually take any meaningful form.
Right. And, you know, I'd encourage any foreign observers who still have a fluffy view of the ANC to I have speaking to an opposition MP this morning, and he told me about how the ANC was like celebrating the voting down of the ad hoc committee to investigate Phala Phala in Parliament, with everyone cheering and treating it as though it was some sort of great victory that they had voted down this thing, very reminiscent of the Zuma years. So you think anything has changed?
Can I just say in response to that I think it was the same opposition MP that noted, or commenting on something John Steenhuisen said, that they had right to celebrate because they celebrated not appointing a committee that actually has the power of arrest and the search and seizure of documentation, whereas the other committees are all sort of
mumbo jumbo. Yeah.
So they have
No,
lots of things
exactly.
to celebrate.
But the priority is revealed to be escaping corruption charges, not not changing the economy.
What do you think?
Oh, okay. Let us move on to our next story. And this is some comments by our new, Minister of Electricity. I can't remember the official title, Minister of Electricity in the presidency or whatever he's called, Minister Ramokgopa, who has been on a tour of Eskom's coal power stations to get to the heart of the load shedding issue. I will, just as a tangent, note that I did find it rather amusing that load shedding disappeared just for the EFF's national shutdown, which was primarily about load shedding, and then reappeared the next day. Not to be too cynical, but it makes one wonder. Anyway, so Minister Ramokgopa says that, after going through this tour and talking to the managers of these power stations, he can come away with the conclusion that, in fact, corruption is not really a big deal at Eskom. And that it's all due to problems with design and investment. And that's simply, correcting some of these mistakes, adjusting things, changing the management a bit, will deliver much greater output from a lot of Eskom's power stations. He also flagged Tutuka Power Station, which is the worst performing power station of Eskom, as being the one place where there really was corruption standing in the way of getting better results. Now, this sort of headline finding that corruption is not at the heart of Eskom's operational troubles, there's some truth to that if you interpret that to mean that we have bad policies that created this issue, that we had a bad strategy, that we had a completely wrong ideological approach to how electricity generation should happen. Those are all reasonable criticisms of what's going wrong at Eskom, and they're much more than corruption. But if you mean to say that people, stealing things and inflating costs and doing shoddy work is not to do with Eskom's problems, then you're completely out of your mind. Because when he talks about like a design problem at the plant, well, why did that design problem get created in the first place? I think it's very difficult to come up with an explanation that does not involve at least some corruption. Sara, what do you make of this?
I almost expect David Mabuza to put out a press release saying, we flatly deny the minister's assertion that corruption isn't a big issue at Eskom. It is a very big issue at Eskom. I mean, as you say, I mean, what are the managers at the various plants going to say or do to him? It just defies belief. And as the comment says, he asked these if they were doing anything wrong, and they said no, not us. I mean, as you say, it's not as if corruption is the only issue at Eskom, but the consequences flow into the inefficiencies, the incompetence, the design flaws, etc., etc. It's inseparable, and no one is going to tell the minister that no, we have no, corruption is really the problem. I mean, of course, the problem is if it's not the problem, then the other problems can have more focused attention. But if it is the problem, you're not going to solve the other problems unless you get to grips with the corruption. So maybe he'll have a different view when he gets back to the office. I don't know, reads a report on the criminality.
I must say, I'm continuing to be shocked by the ANC's sort of bungling of messaging on load shedding. There's sort of been this line, one of the lines that they seem to have been pursuing is, oh, well, we just didn't do enough maintenance. And if we just do enough maintenance, the problem will be gone in 18 months. Which kind of creates a whole bunch of questions such as, why weren't you doing maintenance? Now, I don't think that's true. I think that, I've heard from a lot of people that the problems at Eskom are much deeper than simply just doing some more maintenance. And that the, reworks, overhauls, and rebuilding is far more accurate as to what it is to fix the problem. But also, we recently had, I think it was the board of, the chairperson of the board of Eskom saying, well, we should be thankful for stage 2 and 3.
Celebrate it.
Celebrate it. We should celebrate it, not just be thankful. And now we have the minister saying, no, corruption is not the problem. Never mind the sort of systemic analysis for a second, which you've just been through, Sara, but this is just bad politics. You're not going to win over anyone by saying that corruption is not a problem at Eskom. Makone, what do you make of this?
I think the minister should be careful that he's not being used to manage Eskom's dwindling reputation, because he seems to be going on these power station visits with a conclusion beforehand, which is that there is no corruption, despite the fact that he actually says in the article, they quote him as saying that he's spoken to a couple of managers who will tell him, look into corruption. Some parts, there are parts that are super exorbitant. The prices are just so overinflated. People are being awarded tenders irregularly. But despite that, the minister still walks away telling us that he doesn't think corruption is that big of an issue at Eskom. I think we have wondered for a long time why we needed a minister of electricity, and despite the fact that he was brought into office through a state of emergency, he was only ever appointed weeks and weeks after the emergency was announced. It's becoming apparent now why he's there to manage the government's reputation on its failures at Eskom. That's my first item. I think that one of the comments that he made, which really, really worry me, is just, is anything going to be done at Eskom about the corruption that's going on there? Doesn't seem like there is.
What really freaks me out is the fact that there is once again no talk of any kind of reform, as we've just been going on about, right? There's no reform to the procurement process to kind of strip out the BE stuff that has been a cover for so much corruption. There is no reform to cadre deployment or racial hiring or anything like that. It's all just, well, no, we just haven't spent enough money on Eskom. That's the problem. Sara, final thoughts.
One of the comments, can I just say, one of the comments he also made was, I'm not a policeman. Now, we know exactly what he's responding to when he says that. It's when Minister Gwedemantashe called Director a policeman for constantly bringing up the corruption activities that are happening at Eskom. He should concern himself with other things other than covering up for Mantashe.
Sorry, final thoughts in 30 seconds.
I think he's too much in the ANC mold. They needed someone who would get on with work, say nothing, not advertise his trips to the. I mean, you know what happens when they go on these trips to these things. It's sort of a whole cavalcade and Blue Light Brigade, and everyone's taking selfies. He should have said nothing. He should just have his head down, and not being a policeman. Hell, that's what he's there to be.
Exactly.
Madness. Anyway, that's all the time we have for today. So thank you very much for listening. We hope that you found the show interesting, and we will be back next week with the Daily Friend Show. Cheers, everyone, and have a wonderful weekend.